All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's seminar. We're going to get started in just a few minutes as folks join the seminar. I'm Hans from the Non-GMO Project, and as we wait for people to come in, I do want to take this moment to acknowledge that we're presenting this seminar from the Non-GMO Project offices in Bellingham, Washington, and we're on the unceded ancestral lands of the Lummi Nation, the Nooksack tribe, and the Coast Salish people who've been stewards of this area for thousands of years. This is also a good reminder that this is the third in a series of educational seminars that we'd like to present primarily to the industry, but anybody interested in the public about what's going on with new GMOs, GMOs 2.0. There's been a lot going on. You're going to hear about that from our on-staff expert here in just a few moments. A couple other reminders, we publish a monthly new GMOs alert. If you're interested in staying up to date on all the crazy new ingredients and products that are coming to the market, that's a great way to stay abreast of what's going on, and a great way to remind you that if you want to be a part of the non-GMO coalition, we want to be in touch with you, in communication with you, and those new GMO alerts is a great way to just kind of keep up on the news, and there is a lot of news. Okay, let's get started. You can switch my slide here, my colleague Jade. Thank you very much. Okay, welcome everyone. We are now getting started. So I'm very pleased to facilitate today's seminar as a part of our Non-GMO Project September campaign, Who's Driving the Future of Plant-Based Foods? This seminar is brought to you in part by the Butterfly Alliance, which is just people like you who have made generous donations to support our work. As you probably know, the Non-GMO Project is North America's most credible and recognized authority on GMOs in our food system. We advocate for labeling, regulation, and testing of GMOs, and more importantly, to promote non-GMO options for eaters who prefer to avoid GMOs. Today, we're going to celebrate the growth of plant-based foods and all of the innovation going on in this space. So why are we having a September campaign on plant-based foods? As you all are probably aware, the natural foods industry has recently been grappling anew with issues of whether GMOs should be allowed into natural and organic foods. Why now? Well, because there is a whole new generation of GMO technology that's being applied to food systems, and it's being promoted as a solution for things like climate change and animal welfare. You're probably also aware of the executive order from President Biden that came out just this past Monday, promoting biotechnology across all sectors of our economy, including food and agriculture. Now, the natural industry has long agreed that industrialized animal agriculture is unsustainable and a significant contributor to greenhouse gases and climate change. But it has also, for 30 years or more, rejected GMOs and genetic engineering. So the context has changed. In the past, GMOs were quietly channeled into the food system, primarily as corn, soy, sugar beet derivatives, with no real value proposition to eaters. Today, many GMO companies are putting genetic engineering at the core of their value proposition. So we're hearing terms like animal-free synbio dairy, plant-based hamburgers that bleed, gene-edited eggs, and more. They're all coming into the marketplace, and mostly they're not being labeled as GMOs, and they aren't being regulated or tested more than any other food product would be. But they are being targeted for natural consumers who do care deeply about climate action and animal welfare. But what we really want to get to today is that we believe there's a better way than the quick solutions of biotechnology. We believe non-GMO, organic, and regenerative practices offer the most holistic approach to climate action and to animal welfare. An approach that, by the way, is also beginning to engage with social and economic sustainability issues. Issues like food and seed sovereignty, racial equity, and indigenous foodways. We believe the most meaningful innovation is not happening through biotechnology, but through whole non-GMO foods, minimal processing, and cooperation with nature. So we're excited to bring together this group of folks to start the conversation. We're hoping to spend about 30 or 40 minutes setting the stage for conversation with all of you for the last 20 minutes or so. So please use the question function for any comments or questions that you might have this morning, and hopefully we'll be able to get to some generative conversation flowing with our guests here. The way we'll set this up is first, I'll present some of the findings of the non-GMO project's consumer and sales research. There's strong evidence both in sales numbers and in consumer insights that natural eaters show a strong preference for plant-based foods that are non-GMO, and the non-GMO project Butterfly is an important wayfinder for them. After I've covered recent market and consumer trends, we'll hear from Linda Cognato. She's the project's lead researcher on biotechnology. Linda writes a quarterly report. It's the only one of its kind that we know of that monitors all of the new biotechnology that's being developed for food systems. She also, as I mentioned earlier, writes our New GMOs Alert newsletter, so do please sign up for that if you haven't already. After we've gotten a quick overview of new GMO technologies and ingredients coming into plant-based foods, we're going to hear about some of the great innovation happening in non-GMO, organic, and regenerative food production. For this, we're going to hear from Nicole Atchison. She's the CEO of Purest Foods. Last year, they were recognized as Fast Company's most innovative food company of 2021. Purest is a plant-based producer of pea proteins. We're going to hear more from Nicole about all the fabulous work that they're doing. And finally, I'm super excited to have Alicia Kennedy join us today. Alicia is widely recognized as one of the most interesting and important new voices in the good food movement. Alicia is an essayist and reporter, and she's deeply thoughtful about the intersection of veganism, vegetarianism, technology, and issues of food sovereignty. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. So what's all the hype with plant-based foods? Well, there's plenty of evidence that it's just not hype. As these stats show you, sales of plant-based foods have exploded, especially during the pandemic, when we saw lots of pantry loading, food service was shut down, and people were shopping for a more diverse, hopefully more healthy diet. Natural and plant-based foods were already trending, but the pandemic really amplified this trend. While this trend is exploding, it perhaps is not surprising at all to see considerable investment coming in to develop this market, including large sums of venture capital going into biotechnology applied to the plant-based space. As Linda will show you in a moment, we're seeing an explosion not just in non-GMO, natural, and organic plant-based foods, but also the bioengineered foods intended to replace traditional animal-derived foods. So let's go to the next slide. At the project, we've been working now for 3 years with Linkage Consulting on better understanding consumer attitudes about natural foods. And like everyone else, we've been interested to find out more about who, on the demand side of things, is driving plant-based food sales. While plant-based foods are appealing today to a broad spectrum of eaters, we really saw younger natural consumers driving this trend in a meaningful way. We saw older eaters often choosing non-GMO for personal health reasons. These consumers who sort of grew up alongside the natural products industry are really shopping for clean labels. And this is especially true as they get older and start dealing with all the typical aches and pains of their 40s and 50s and beyond. So the older natural shopper is really trying to control their diet for personal health reasons. Younger natural eaters are interested in foods and brands that really align with their values, which isn't to say that older consumers aren't worried about shopping their values. It's just a primary motivator for younger natural shoppers. In their youth, the natural industry was already well established. So somewhat coincidentally, this generation, and we're talking primarily about millennials here, they are both tech native, they grew up with smartphones, and they're native to the natural foods marketplace. This group of shoppers, which is, by the way, the largest generation in history, isn't shopping so much for control, but for a cause. They want to make the world a better place with their purchasing decisions. When it comes to big existential crises like climate change, they want to do the right thing, but they don't automatically want to do the technologically advanced thing. In fact, they see the limits of technology. They know technology, especially industrial technology, is precisely the cause of climate change. So they're very skeptical of using more industrial processes to fix problems created by the last generation of industrial processes. So the final point, bullet point here is interesting. The two primary reasons that millennials are choosing plant-based foods is because they believe they are better for their personal health and better for the planet. And they definitely show a preference for non-GMO options. So as we look at this next slide, I don't want to go too deeply into consumer insights around the intersection of non-GMO and plant-based foods. I can create a whole secondary presentation and study about that. But I will refer to a just released white paper that we authored in collaboration with SPINS. Whatever the reasons that are motivating eaters to buy plant-based foods, it's clear that they are showing a strong preference for non-GMO project verified options. In our research, we found that the majority of plant-based food sales carry the butterfly. It's a great convergence of values. If you care about eating plant-based foods and you care about them being non-GMO, the butterfly is a great shortcut to trust. As the second bullet alludes to here, the butterfly is recognized by 1/3 of all North American shoppers, not just natural shoppers. And it's a strong influence to purchase that's comparable to and really complementary to USDA organic. And finally, again, hot off the presses from our white paper with SPINS, we saw explosive growth of verified non-GMO plant-based foods from 2019 to 2021, significantly more growth than plant-based foods that were unlabeled. Verified non-GMO plant-based meats in the freezer saw a whopping 72% growth compared to a growth rate of about 10% for products that were unlabeled with reference to GMOs. So if you're a plant-based food brand considering whether or not to get verified, we think these numbers are pretty compelling. To me, they say one thing: natural eaters appreciate innovation, but they have questions about plant-based foods that they might be too highly processed or actually synthetic. Just to be clear, they consider GMOs to be synthetic and unnatural. So it's helpful to them to see the butterfly on products that can oftentimes have quite long ingredient lists. So finally, this will be the last you hear from me, some quick data points on consumer attitudes to technology and food. When you look specifically at natural consumers, about 44% of all North American adults, these numbers actually hover more around 90%. We asked natural consumers how they feel about GMOs, and 89% agreed with the statement, "I want my foods to be natural and GMOs are unnatural." So, not surprisingly, 3 out of 5 shoppers have doubts about synthetic foods. They have doubts about safety, the healthfulness, and the nutritiousness of plant-based foods that are synthetic, that is, that contain GMOs and synthetic biology. Finally, in anticipation of hosting Alicia on our seminar today, I looked at our research to see how communities of color feel about technology and food. In previous conversations I've had with Alicia, I've been curious about, we rarely hear about BIPOC communities really embracing GMOs and biotechnology, and why GMOs tend to be so controversial in the global South. What I can tell you from our data in North America is that these communities clearly don't embrace these technologies. Alicia will talk a bit about why she thinks that might be the case as we look at plant-based foods in the context of social justice, food sovereignty, and economic equity. So now it's time for me to hand it over to Linda Cognato. Again, she's my colleague at the project. She's one of our lead researchers. She's going to be telling us all about the new biotechnology in the plant-based space that's happening not really because of consumer demand, but actually, in my view, in spite of it, given all the research that I've just touched on here. So Linda, over to you.
Thank you, Hans. So in order to set the stage before we talk about new GMOs, I'd very much like to just give a brief overview of what we refer to as traditional GMOs. And these are genetically modified organisms that were primarily developed during the 1990s by large agrochemical companies. And they involved a relatively small number of crops. So originally, when the non-GMO project started, we had 8 crops on our high-risk list. And these are crops that were at high risk for being genetically modified. The focus was on high commodity crops, such as corn, soy, cotton, and sugar beet. And the majority of those crops were modified for herbicide tolerance, with a smaller number modified for insect resistance. So these are traits that were primarily of benefit to farmers. These were not traits that were of benefit to the general population and to eaters. And so they showed up in plant-based foods not only as primary ingredients, such as corn in corn chips, but also as derivatives of those. So for example, if you think of cornstarch or you think of soy isolate. So many times these products showed up on ingredient panels when consumers were not able to easily identify them as being genetically modified. Next slide, please. So now we have something called new GMOs. In some cases, they're referred to as GMO 2.0. And these new GMOs differ in a number of ways. One is that they involve more than just crops. They involve a greater number of crops, but they also involve the modification of animals and microorganisms. And in terms of microorganisms, you'll often hear the term today, synthetic biology or synbio. And basically what that is a way of genetically modifying microorganisms such as yeast or bacteria or algae to get that, to exploit that microorganism for what it does naturally and get it to produce a novel product such as blood or such as animal-free dairy proteins. These derivatives or products of these new GMO techniques, and specifically synbio here, are now showing up as new ingredients in the food supply. These are products that have been developed over the past 5 to 6 years, and we're now seeing them explode on the market. And in many cases, consumers do not know how to identify these ingredients in products. Many of these replicate animal-derived products, such as dairy proteins, egg proteins, collagen, or honey, and they're being marketed to consumers as being vegan-friendly choices, but also as a way to help save the planet. So they're making significant sustainability claims, saying that they are essential for saving the planet and convincing consumers to buy them on that basis. Next slide, please. So the question then for consumers and for everyone is, are new GMOs essential for sustainability? And the simple answer here, and there is a simple answer, is no. New GMOs are not essential for sustainability, and the non-GMO does not equal anti-sustainability. Furthermore, sustainability is only one of a range of global concerns, and those include, as Hans alluded to, equity, biodiversity, food scarcity, worker displacement, neocolonialism, and who controls our food supply? Do we want that food supply controlled by 1% of the population? The Non-GMO project has over 2,500 verified products from more than 300 participants in the plant-based food sector. And this is very significant. Many of these companies are working to create a sustainable food system. And they are not doing it using genetic modification. Some of these companies are actually at the forefront of innovation. And to talk a little bit more about that, I'd like to introduce Nicole Atchison, who is CEO of Purest Foods. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Hans. It's really exciting to hear some of that, the brief data that Hans presented about the growing rate of sales of non-GMO project verified plant-based food. And it's really exciting for me personally, because this is a journey that my family's business has been on for 40 years. So to see some of the momentum building at the stores today is just fantastic. My parents founded our business. So I'm Nicole Atchison. I run Purest Holdings, and we're a family business. My parents founded our business nearly 40 years ago with a really quite simple concept that as the population of the world grew, people would need to eat more plants, and so therefore plants needed to taste great, and that we should start at the seed level. And we would say back then, this is in the 80s and 90s, that we were a plant-based food company. And if anyone was around in the 80s and 90s, you can probably imagine how uncool that was at the time and how quite strange it actually sounded. But fast forward to today, that's the business that we run. We are a vertically integrated plant-based food company. What does that mean? So we work from the seed and the genetics side of the business all the way to food production. And this entire journey using non-GMO, keeping non-GMO and organic at the forefront, with the belief that if we can make seeds and plants that taste amazing, then we're creating a foundation from which you can innovate and make amazing products that people everywhere want to eat and can meet consumers and eaters right where they're at. So today we operate a breeding platform. And so when people hear breeding and genetics, it sometimes feels maybe a little bit scary. What does that actually mean? What are you doing? But really, we're using natural crossbreeding methods to make the plants better for farmers so that they can yield and resist disease pressures and weeds. We're also increasing the nutritional profile of the plants, or making them adapted to different areas so that certain plants can be used in areas where maybe they haven't been able to be grown before, to improve and increase the tool belt of a farmer. Once we have these seeds that can work well for a farmer, but also are great for a food manufacturer, they taste great, they have high nutrition, they have good color, which is actually a really important trait in food as well. Farmers grow those seeds, they grow them on their land, we purchase them back, and then we process them. And the processing step is often overlooked in food production. We talk a lot about agriculture and we talk a lot about food. And the messy middle in between is where Purest lives and breathes. We own and operate manufacturing plants that take these crops that the farmers have worked so hard to grow and nourish and transform them into usable whole seeds or ingredients that food makers can use. And during this journey, it's important to keep them separate and segregated so that the non-GMO qualities of them don't get commingled with genetically modified versions. As Linda just showed us, there is a high prevalence of GMOs in commodity cropping systems. So it's really important that we have a purposeful design of infrastructure for processing. Once we have clean seeds, we then process them into ingredients. So Purest is the largest manufacturer of pea protein, starch, and fiber in North America. It's a product and a journey that we started in 2015, but we actually started breeding yellow field peas in 1999, if you can believe it. And so in the early days, we did a lot of convincing people that pea protein could taste good. And today, it's exciting to see pea protein in categories all across the store. And so when we think about how do you innovate around food, it's more than just making pea protein. It's how do we make a protein that can enable a plant-based beverage that gives great mouthfeel, got light color, it can be vanilla or chocolate, and creating the right protein for the right application. And we take a very intentional approach to this. And again, it's when we think about technology and innovation, there's a lot of media attention around different end products. There's a lot of work happening behind the scenes from companies like ours, Purest, but also companies throughout the industry in flavors and starches and ways that we can bring different pieces of plants together to create really amazing taste profiles. And what's exciting about the business that Purest is in is that we enable this. We work across the entire grocery store with different products, from milks or plant-based milks to plant-based cheeses to meats to cereals and snacks. And the types of ingredients and the types of proteins that are used in these are different. And that innovation is happening behind the scenes and is often hidden a little bit from the consumer. But that really doesn't mean it's scary. What it should mean is it's exciting, because we're in the first inning of innovation in plant-based foods. When I think about the journey that some of the food industries have been on, it's been centuries long. What we're doing right now with plant proteins is just getting started. And so we like to think that there's anything is possible with plants. Plants are amazing. They make protein, they use sunlight to create nutrition. And that's really an amazing thing. And it's our job to figure out how can we leverage that to make products that people want to eat. Because if people don't want to eat it, it stops right there. And so it's got to be delicious. It's got to be nutritious, and it's got to give back more to the planet than it takes away. And so the last stage in the cycle, of course, is the food. And so Purest also does a lot of work on product innovation and creating products that you see on the shelf under other brands. And we're actually starting with some of our own consumer brands, which is really new for us, but as I mentioned, has been part of the story all along. One of the things Hans asked me to talk about is how innovation is showing up in plant-based. And I've talked a little bit about that, but really there's two big categories of innovation that is at the forefront of plant-based foods today. One is around regenerative agriculture. How are we growing these crops, and what are the tools and the innovation needed to make cropping production systems more sustainable? One of the biggest detractors of plant-based foods is that they're coming sometimes from monocropping systems and sometimes from GMO systems. And what Purest is trying to develop is ways to grow these plant-based food commodity crops in a way that is regenerative, can add diversity to cropping systems, and can actually help farmers create and restore their soil and improve their profitability, because it has to work for both. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there's a ton of innovation happening on the food side. And I look around and I see how artificial intelligence is being used to help researchers find plants from nature to combine them to make amazing taste profiles. That's a really cool way to leverage technology and non-GMO sources to make great food products. You see in meat and eggs, a lot of innovation happening with non-GMO sources. Purest is doing a lot of this behind the scenes, and we are really passionate about this, and it's been a journey that we've been on for 40 years and plan to continue to be on for another 40 or maybe more. I guess that'll be up to my kids at some point. But it's really exciting, and I'm happy to share more, and just thank you for the opportunity of being here. So I'll send it back to you, Hans.
Thank you so much, Nicole. So interesting to hear about specific innovation happening in plant-based. Every bit as exciting, more exciting in a lot of respects than what we're seeing going on in the biotechnology space. So we're talking about plant-based foods. Plant-based foods have always been a part of the natural foods industry, and at the center of the target, as it were, has been vegans and vegetarians. They've always been core to the natural products industry. And I'm welcoming Alicia with us now. Alicia, how are the vegan and vegetarian communities receiving these kinds of products? And let's be clear, this is a small percentage of the total eating population, but they're having an influence. And we're seeing a lot of flexitarians going meatless Mondays and really looking at these products and interested in the innovation that's happening here. So what can you tell us about how the vegan and vegetarian communities might be receiving this sudden uptick in interest in plant-based foods, and then how they might feel about these technologies? And I think you bring a really interesting perspective on what communities of color and indigenous communities might feel about plant-based foods, and how and what level of innovation they might be engaged with, especially as with reference to biotechnologies. I'll turn it over to you, Alicia.
Sure. Well, thank you, Hans, and hello, everyone, and thank you for having me today. I'm a food writer based in San Juan, Puerto Rico. So to answer Hans's question, I would say, one, even though the vegan and vegetarian population is such a small percentage of the eating population, it's also a very, very kind of factionalized perspective in terms of what is important to folks. You know, you're going to have people who are coming at it from a spiritual place, from an ethical place, from a environmental perspective, from a cultural perspective. So there's not going to be one unified approach to vegan or vegetarian thought and vegan or vegetarian approach to subjects like GMOs and biotechnology. I would say that in terms of the most vocal folks in this kind of community and the people getting published, et cetera, there are, you know, two main strains of thought when it comes to veganism and genetically modified organisms and biotechnology. There is kind of the eco-modernist strain, which sees the potential of technology to ensure both the future of food and a high standard of living, such as the one experienced in the global north, without kind of sacrificing ecology. They see, you know, things such as lab meat and different high yield approaches to agriculture as ways of kind of getting everyone on board toward a more plant-based way of eating and just ensuring the continued existence of the planet. So that's one strain. Others see regionality, farm worker-led movements as the way forward. When discussing plant-based foods, I think, and I'm certainly more toward this side, which is probably why I'm here, there's a natural alliance in the approach of regionality, biodiversity, farm worker led movement folks in the plant-based side with non-GMO foods because of ecological impacts, of course, pesticide impacts on farm workers, and a desire to see an equitable as well as sustainable food system where food is not owned by a small number of agribusiness companies. So, in my job as a food writer, especially one who's focused on plant-based foods, I say that sort of with hesitance because I don't see myself necessarily as that being like the only thing I talk about. But, as someone in this space, my role is to inform an audience about issues in food, from agriculture and sustainability to labor and ethics, and how that affects what appears in the grocery store, on plates, on restaurant menus. And because of that, it's really a job about kind of steering consumerism, steering consumption in maybe the best or better ways that are possible. But when it comes to these questions, and this is what I've discussed before with Hans, we also have to talk about food as culturally appropriate and foods as cultural touchstones, the joy, sustenance we get on a daily basis, the pleasure we get on a daily basis. And so when we envision, the future of food, we're considering the future as something that is to make land sustainable, to keep workers healthy, to keep workers paid well, perhaps, to ensure animal welfare, and also to ensure culture and gastronomy. And so when it comes to these questions about the future of food, I'm asking, how can we remake the global food system so that it is sustainable, sustains everyone, is ecologically sound, and what role do vegans, vegetarians, this plant-based food movement or idea, what roles do they play? And so for me, as someone who hasn't eaten meat in over a decade, there hasn't been a big change for me in terms of these products coming onto the market, in terms of this big growth. The big growth, I think, in this space has been something that it's been for omnivores. It's been for those flexitarians who want to cut out a little bit of dairy, want to cut out a little bit of meat. And so, they pick that option at Starbucks, or they pick that option at their local coffee shop or lunch spot. And, that's really where I think this growth has been focused. For me, when it came to, the launch of the Impossible Foods burger, for example, it launched in really high-end chefy restaurants and got a lot of media attention for its possibility to change the world and get people off of eating beef so much. But eventually, to meet demand, it started to be made with genetically modified soy, to go to Burger King, to go to Starbucks, to be in all these places. And so, when we are focusing this conversation so much around protein and maintaining what is already an overconsumption of protein in the US specifically, we're kind of creating this false demand for genetically modified soy specifically, or other proteins. And it's an artificial one that should, that should be discussed. And I think it's been kind of a misstep to see that people transitioning to plant-based foods are confident in these technologies, are confident in GMOs. I think that has shown that there isn't a real interest in conversion, so to speak, and or like a really solid movement toward that style of eating. There's more of a desire to simply kind of commodify and make money off of this association with plant-based foods, rather than a real commitment to this kind of this style of eating and this approach to food. And so, and I specifically think a lot about here in Puerto Rico, where for years, decades, multinational companies, including, Bayer, formerly known as Monsanto, have used huge swaths of land to conduct seed experiments to get tax breaks. And there are documented complaints from residents of areas like Juana Diaz, of sickness and allergies, and because of the pesticide usage, because of this experimentation going on. And so there is locally here, at least, and I think this is probably true of many places in the global south, a mistrust of biotechnology and genetically modified ingredients for this reason. Here, agroecology is ascendant among small and young farmers. The archipelago has already experienced both the ravages of giving land to these companies, as well as the ravages of climate change. You know, Hurricane Maria happened almost exactly 5 years ago. And so the control of agriculture as well from the United States, which pushed the economy toward sugar, decimated that industry, moved it toward pharmaceuticals. And so now the supermarkets are dominated by large agribusiness. 85% of food is imported. The population is not served culturally, nutritionally, or economically by this kind of consolidation and control. And I think that that's a really significant aspect of why also genetically modified organisms and biotechnology are mistrusted, because, you know, that kind of outsider and very small, you know, that 1% of the population type of control over agriculture has not served local people. And so I think focusing the conversation of plant-based foods away from genetically modified ingredients, away from these kind of GMO 2.0 products will really be a boon to convincing more people that plant-based foods can be culturally appropriate for everybody, can be a part of everybody's diet. And I think going forward, it will only become more significant for folks to understand the origin of their ingredients in their foods completely, not less important.
So awesome. Thank you so much, Alicia. Really important perspectives. And I think that we're going to take some questions now, but from my perspective, it's a conversation that doesn't happen enough. In our those of us who work in the natural products industry have sort of fallen prey to speaking about food as a commodity, and in many respects it is a commodity, but bringing it back home and saying food plays such a big part in our lives. It's not exactly the same thing as buying fuel for your car. There's so many community considerations. It's a cultural touchstone for so many people. And I recall a conversation that I had last year with a fabulous novelist, Diane Wilson. And in her novel, she talks about foods that have no spirit, and referring particularly to GMO foods, and recognizing that food is so much more than a simple commodity. And one thing that can be said, I think, about a lot of food brands in the commodity space, and we see it a lot in the biotechnology space, is essentially we want to plug and play this food solution in the existing food system without any considerations for farm worker justice and equity, for cultural and regional impacts and sensitivities there. And I think what we are seeing on the organic, non-GMO regenerative side is a much more holistic solution for important crises like the crisis in biodiversity, like the crisis in climate change. So as we transition here into just a few questions to get the panel juiced up, if you guys all want to come back on camera, I'm going to pose some questions to you. So great to see you all back. Hopefully we get Linda back with us as well. Very good. Thank you, Linda. I'm going to start with you, Alicia. I've heard you use the term eco-modernist before in the context of veganism, vegetarianism. What do you mean when you use that term eco-modernist, and how can more of us use that term when we're talking about some of these issues? It's a really intriguing term.
It means, you know, that these are folks who believe that technology can reduce environmental impacts while maintaining, you know, the high standard of living enjoyed in places like the US, in Europe, and that sort of thing, with, you know, that economic growth and environmentalism are necessarily at odds. So it's a train of thought that has a lot of support in the vegan community, or among vegan thinkers, because of the idea that it would push people toward a plant-based diet, and that these products can do that. Yeah.
Yeah. So would you consider, you don't consider yourself an eco-modernist then? I take it. No. Nicole, you're an industry insider. You're an amazing innovator in the plant-based space. Is there room at the table for these biotechnology companies? And I guess I'll ask the question more pointedly. You've made a commitment to sustainability in a very specific way in terms of organic, non-GMO, regenerative. I'm curious about your views and your commitment to that, and how the name of your company actually reflects that.
Oh, that's an interesting question, Hans. That's not a story that we tell very often, but really we actually started in soybeans way back in the day. So Linda shared an interesting graphic at the beginning. I think it's something like 95 or 96% of all soybeans produced in the United States are genetically modified. And so here we are, small family company, trying to do something different. And that was something that we took really seriously. And so my dad would say, pure is non-GMO, 99%, non-GMO. And so we had really high standards for, any contamination or different things. And so we would use this. Pure is knowing where your crops are grown. Pure is, having sources that you can trust, knowing your farmer. Pure is, etc. And so that's where Purest came from. It came from this like pure is what we were making. And so for a long time, it was just part of our product names. And we actually changed our company name to that about 5 years ago. But really, it's this concept that there's always people out there who want to know where their food comes from. And it is our job to provide options for both farmers and eaters who care. And it can be daunting when you're in the face of a market that's moving very swiftly in the other direction. So if you think about the 90s, the transformation of cropping systems from non-GMO to GMO was dramatic and fast. And so to be kind of like a rock in that river was difficult at times, but we just held very true that there was always going to be people who cared and wanted options. And if you read about the consolidation of industries, of seed, of chemicals, even of the meat industry, like they're massively consolidated. And so having independent companies stay in existence is necessary to keep momentum building. Because if everyone stopped in the 90s, we wouldn't have very much to work with right now. And so we need innovators and believers out there who go against the grain, because we need diversity of everything if we're gonna have a resilient food system. And so that's really what we believe in, is that we need resiliency in our food system, and that means diversity. That means having different genetics so that when climate disaster strikes, which happens every other year right now, we have, we still have moves to make as a population. And that's what we believe in. And we're doing that through non-GMO methods. And we think that there is a huge role for that industry to play, and a ton of growth, because we have, we have our work cut out for us. We got to battle some of the big guys.
Yeah, and just to be clear, we've referenced a couple of times, and we've been talking a lot about new GMOs, but old GMOs are very much the problem that they've been now for 30 years. Linda referenced that, and make no mistake about it, this corn, soy, GMO corn and soy 1.0 was grown for one reason, and that was to make farming easier. You could plant it, and then you could spray with toxic herbicides, or plant a corn that produces its own insecticide, and that was the reason it was done, to make farming easier. Essentially, you could just spray your fields 5, 6, 7 times during the year. It would kill everything else other than those genetically modified plants. So non-GMO is not easy, right? Nicole, can you tell us a little bit about some of the challenges that farmers deal with in growing non-GMO, and some of the things that Purest has done to try to make that a bit easier for them?
If you've ever spent any time in a field in, the middle of the United States, you can see the problem. And the problem is pervasive on both GMO and non-GMO fields, but weeds they're a problem, and it's a nightmare for farmers, and it is a big impact to their livelihood, because weeds, you got to give them credit. They have a will to live, and they can take over, and they take all the nutrients out of the soil and they put them in the crop that you're not trying to grow. And so what does that do to the crop? It reduces the yields, which reduces profitability, can make it super hard to harvest, and it's a whole host of problems. So I think it is something that the non-GMO industry needs to take really seriously, is understanding the challenges that farmers face and the why they may want to adopt some of these technologies, is because it's not just that they are lazy and don't want to work, but there's a real challenge with weed pressure in these fields. And so the newest movement around regenerative agriculture and trying to go, back away from monocrop or just dual cropping systems to using more cover crops, relay cropping, different methods to actually keep the ground more covered so you can outcompete and break up weed cycles. It gives you a whole host of other benefits, but weed management is a big one, and building nutrition back in the soil. So what we do is when we're in the breeding part of our business and we're selecting different varieties, we think about traits that improve the agronomics of the crop. So that could be something like quick to canopy. So that probably means nothing to most people on this call, but it really means is when the plant grows, it kind of comes together quickly so the sunlight doesn't hit the soil. That helps weeds not grow. And so genetics that can shoot out of the soil and cover the soil quick can help with weed management. We've also been adapting yellow field peas to work in more areas. Yellow field pea grows in about 90 days, where most other crops take 100, 120 or longer. And so if you're in, away from the equator where you have maybe one growing season, you might be able to now fit a second one or plant a little bit earlier where you keep the ground more covered, but instead of just being a cover crop, you can also generate revenue from that. So if you're going to a farmer and you say, I want you to plant a cover crop, they think of that as a cost center. So that barrier to adoption is a little bit higher. But if you come with something that can maybe generate revenue for them, that's a little bit easier to kind of enter into. And so we really think about arming the farmer with different tools that they can improve their profitability, help manage weeds, and designing that in from the very beginning as we're designing and developing and picking which varieties to commercialize.
Excellent. Yeah, and it's important to note that those kinds of practices actually sink carbon back in the soil. And a provocative question we might ask is, what is the biotech industry actually doing to sequester and sink carbon? And we don't hear answers to that oftentimes. And that's why I think all of us on this panel are in agreement that industrialized agriculture, problem. What's our best solution? My view, and I think others would agree, is that one of our best solutions is organic and regenerative agriculture that actually can not only stop contributions of global of greenhouse gases, but actually be sinking carbon back into the ground and really working with nature, as nature, unimpeded, will naturally do that. So important to point that out. I want to shift gears a little bit here. Actually, first I'll answer a question that came in from the audience asking us about USDA's requirement to label bioengineered foods. Bioengineered, by the way, new term invented by the USDA to cover some GMOs. Often we call it the bioengineered foods disclosure standard, or the NBFDS is the acronym for that. Our view of that is it's insufficient. It doesn't cover all GMOs. And if you're concerned about GMOs in your food, you'll want to be looking for the butterfly to have you covered there. It's a complex new law, not that new, actually passed in 2016, didn't go into effect until January of 2022. And now you're beginning to see a lot of conventional food products will include just a little disclaimer on the ingredient panel saying the product might contain bioengineered foods. So from our view, it's not very helpful. Ultimately, we all remember the movement to get GMOs labeled on foods. One of the outcomes of that was what we view as a fairly weak law that's carried out by the USDA to label some GMOs, not as GMOs, but as bioengineered foods. And it's not nearly as expansive as we'd like to see that as we advocate for consumers who just want to know more about what's in their food. So I want to shift gears a little bit here over to you, Linda. We also hear oftentimes conflated in the conversation about plant-based foods and alternative proteins, this term cell-cultured meats. Now, that's not the same thing as plant-based foods. What can you tell us as long as we're talking about alternative proteins, about what's going on in the cell cultured meat space, how that's similar and maybe different than synbio plant-based foods.
Sure, Hans, thank you. First of all, I'd like to say that we have had plant-based meat analogs or plant-based, for example, hamburgers in this country, in the United States, for decades. And those are things that were commonly sold in the freezer section. They were made of beans and sweet potato and legumes, a number of other whole natural products. Now what we're seeing, we still have plant-based meat analogs, and technology has taken us to a point where they can be more varied. And a lot of those are still based on whole plants. But what we're starting to see is some inroads that synthetic biology developers are making into that space. And so, for example, you have the Impossible Burger, which has a synthetic biology ingredient, heme, that actually makes the burger bleed. We also have in development now something called cell cultured meat, and that is much different from plant-based meat analogs in that that is actually meat. Those are products that are being created by harvesting meat cells from animals and then cultivating those cells in a laboratory and using those cells to actually make a food product. A lot of research has been going on in that space. There are about, I'd say, over 100 developers operating in that space right now. The United States does not have fully developed regulations for the sale of cell cultured meat in this country. Neither does Canada at this point in time. Singapore was the first country to enact those laws, and that was also the first country to make that product available to eaters through a couple of high-end restaurant chains. We are monitoring cell cultured meat because we thought from the beginning that it would be a good opportunity for biotechnology developers to be involved in creating a meat-based product. And there are many stages at which that could happen. So for example, if you look at the entire realm of what it takes to produce cell cultured meat, the animal from which the cells are harvested could be bioengineered, they could be genetically engineered. Then once the cells are harvested, they could also be genetically engineered in the laboratory. There's been a lot of the work that's being done in this space is being done to replace something that was traditionally used to nourish cells in the laboratory, and mostly it was used in medical applications, and that product was fetal bovine serum, often referred to as FBS. FBS has a high ick factor. It's harvested from unborn calves when dairy cows are slaughtered. And so it would be hard for cell cultured meat companies to pass this product off as being more humane if they actually used FBS as a nourishment for their cells. So a lot of the work has been done in that space. Right now, we don't have any definitive information on whether genetic modification is being used by these 100+ developers in their development of cell cultured meat. We do know a couple of companies, a couple of developers have come forth and admitted that they are using CRISPR, they're using new GMO techniques. Some companies have come forward, like Mosa Meats in Europe, and have stated categorically that they are developing their product without the use of GMOs. So to a great extent, all of this is unknown territory. All these companies are extremely secretive because there's a lot of competition not necessarily for eaters, but competition for dollars. It takes a lot of money to create these products. It's been going on for multiple years now without any kind of product to sell. So this takes huge, significant amounts of funding. And so those are primarily the differences in those two products. One is truly plant-based, the other is actually meat-based.
I'm guessing, Alicia, that that's not going to be a big hit with vegans and vegetarians. And so I want to give Alicia the last word here. I think in a lot of ways, at least in my mind, I see, and you've talked a little bit about this polarization in the vegan and vegetarian communities, about those who are maybe open to some of these biotechnologies and those who aren't. So in some ways, it feels like if I'm an ethical vegan, I want to avoid for ethical reasons eating livestock-derived foods. I also see the connection to climate change. It's kind of the choice, the lesser of two evils, right? I might say to myself, I'm not crazy about biotechnology, but I care more about animal welfare. I care more about livestock agriculture. Is that a false dichotomy, or is that a good way of capturing the polarization that seems to be happening here?
I think that is, I don't think that's a false dichotomy. I think that for a lot of people is the polarization point, that they seem to believe that the options are either bioreactors to create lab meat, or there's I don't for me that option is such a false like it's not such a not necessary item that it's such a silly conversation to have all the time. As Linda said, we're so far away from this being reality. We still don't know whether they're ever going to be able to develop this cell cultured meat without a slaughtered animal being at the root of it. And so what is, what the conversation is really, I mean, it's interesting in theory, but in practicality, there's no real choice to make yet. So it's certainly a good thought experiment. But for vegans, I think that for a lot of vegans, I don't think that lab meat or cell cultured meat, which is what they want to call it right now, cultured meat. And so they changed the name to make it sound more appealing because no one wants to eat lab meat. But, to kind of continue to be on that wave of I am an ethical vegan and to still eat, animal derived proteins, that probably isn't going to fly in the end. I think that what the hope is among ethical vegans who do believe in this technology is that this technology will lessen the impact of livestock agriculture and decrease dependence. But I don't think, despite the growth in the plant-based food space or plant-based meat space that we've seen in the last few years, we're not seeing a decrease in meat consumption or industrial meat consumption. So, what do these options really do to change behaviors around meat, especially for omnivores? I'm not sure. And so what we're doing is pouring a lot of money. The USDA gave Tufts University $10 million to start a lab focused on cell cultured meat. There's tons and millions and billions of dollars invested in all these companies, but we don't know whether they're going to actually lead to behavioral change. And so I think that's the question that vegans need to ask is, do we want to focus our energy on this conversation, or do we want to say, let's support farm worker-led movements, let's support biodiversity, let's support agroecology, let's support organic farming, and get people back on legumes, organic legumes for protein, and support small animal agriculture. I think that's the real question for the future.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us, all three of you. It's about all the time that we have as we near the top of the hour here. Awesome conversation. And again, just to remind people, we just heard from the federal government this week that they want to fast track biotechnology. They're talking about a whole bioeconomy and bio-based products, including foods. So this is really a timely issue and an urgent issue, we think, for a natural products industry that needs to be aware that this is coming. And I appreciate Nicole's point that there will always be a marketplace of folks that want to engage with organic, non-GMO, sustainably grown foods and want to avoid GMOs in their food and synthetic foods. And so we're happy to support that community. And we are concerned about this acceleration at the federal level. I want to ask a provocative question. Where is the executive order specifically supporting regenerative, sustainable, small family farms at the same time that we're seeing a tremendous influx of money and governmental support for biotechnology? So really appreciate everybody attending the seminar. Hopefully you agree that the GMO issue is as urgent and relevant as it's ever been, and plant-based foods is really a locus for where a lot of that is happening. If you'd like a call to action today, it would be this: speak to your colleagues and friends, especially those who work in the natural products industry. If you want to be a part of our non-GMO coalition and you share our mission to grow simple, wholesome, non-GMO, natural, plant-based foods, there's a lot of things you can do, but most importantly, stay in touch with us. Subscribe to our new GMO alerts. Consider making a donation to the project so that we can continue to be the most credible authority on keeping GMOs out of natural products in North America. And once again, a big thank you to all of you. Nicole, Alicia, Linda, thanks to you who joined us in the audience, and have yourselves a fabulous Wednesday and a great autumn season.